All right, today's lesson is called A New City. Obviously, unfortunately, we either still don't have books or everybody doesn't have books, the Sunday school books. But hopefully you're getting the emails that are sent out, and it has the title, A New City, and it also has that we'll be covering Revelations 21, verses 10 to 21. And as for those that were on, as you heard me in my prayer, confess the Lord, this is a challenging, Revelations is challenging in and of itself. And Harry did a good job on an introduction last week, called Holy City or something of that nature. At any rate, he covered basically the first part of Revelation 21, and this is a continuation of that. Now, before we get into the lesson, though, I do want to do a little exercise, and it's very simple. This isn't even really a pondering thought. It's really just an exercise. I'm hoping I'll do it myself, and then I'm hoping I can get 2 other volunteers to do it. And the exercise is this. All I want you to do is to describe the color of your floor inside your house. That's it. All you got to do is describe the color of your floor inside your house. If you have, multiple surfaces, you can do your best to just describe them briefly. But here's the catch. The catch is that I want you to do it to where someone who can't see it can understand it. Even a youth could read it and try to, or hear your explanation and could understand it. So I'll go first to give you an example. So in my house we have 3 different floor textures, if you will. The first one is a wood floor. We have a wood floor of chocolate. Okay, so hopefully you're getting an image. The color of chocolate is the color of that wood. Then we also have a carpet floor. Now the carpet that we have is kind of like mowed grass. Like it's about the length of a very shortened mowed grass. And the color of it, I would say, is an almond color, and it's speckled with maybe like an acorn color. Okay, so I'm using words that are hopefully giving you an image of a color. And by the way, the almond color is like the inside of an almond, not the outer shell of the almond, that white milky kind of color. So hopefully you're getting what I'm saying. Like, hopefully people would know what an almond looks like, know what an acorn looks like, and they could maybe get a little bit of a visual of what my carpet would look like. And the last texture that we have is we actually have a tile floor that's kind of like a smooth stone, the texture of it. And the color of it, I would say, is more of the external of a honeydew melon. If you know what the external side, the inside is orange, but the external is that kind of brownish grayish color. It's kind of that color. So that's what I'm asking you to do. Just describe the color of your floor. Is there at least one person that would volunteer to do that?
Yeah, I can describe that. Well, we have a couple of different surfaces too. We have a wood floor, and for those that like sweets, it would be maybe a little bit like a half shade darker than German chocolate. If you had a German chocolate cake, then it would be a little bit darker than that in the living area, hallway. And the kitchen tile would be a hard, kind of a rock surface, stone surface, and that would be like almond milk. And I thought if I was describing it to children, I would describe it in food terms, because that might be the easiest thing for them to relate it to.
Absolutely. Thank you. Is there one more that might give it a try? Okay. All right. That's fine. And I did the same thing. I tried to use more like most people will relate to food. So I tried to use those type colors. It's like, okay, that will tend to translate, because whether someone's in Japan or in Africa, they're probably going to have exposure to almonds. They're probably going to have exposure to acorns. They're probably going to have exposure to chocolate. And now the honeydew melon might be a little bit of a reach, but I couldn't think of another color that would that would fit that. And likewise with Harry talking about, German chocolate and almond milk and that kind of thing, it's something that people could likely pick up and understand. Even hundreds of thousands of years from now, people could possibly look at that and be like, oh, okay, this is what he's basically talking about. Well, you may see where I'm going with this a little bit, that John is doing his best to describe what he's seeing. And as we go through this, we'll see that even though he's doing his best to describe it, even for us, it's maybe a little bit hard to fully visualize. We got a little bit of an image, but we don't have it fully. And even as the descriptions that Deacon Harry and I gave, you have a little bit of an image, but you don't. I'm sure you can't get it fully until you actually physically see it, and that's going to be the same for us. So as I go through this, I hope I do it justice, and I'll teach what God gave to me in explaining, and then if others have other views, I certainly would appreciate. But really what this exercise that I just did, as well as what we're about to read, I think 1 Corinthians 13:12 sums it up very nicely. It says, "For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known." That even in this description that John's given us through Revelations, all the turmoil that he sees, the description of the New Jerusalem, the description of the new city, he's given it to us as best as he can, but we can't fully see it. We see it through a glass darkly. If you've ever put on like dark colored shades, you notice that it distorts the color of the things that you see. And that's what we have. We have a little bit unclear view, but it's enough for us to be able to hold on to it. And I'm going to bring it back to a point as we come to a close. Now, what I want to do before we actually get into Revelations 21:10 and on, I actually want to read Revelation 21:9 and just do a very high-level brief recap of what's going on up to 21:9. So what verse Revelation 21:9 says, "And there came unto me one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials full of the seven last plagues, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." Okay, now, as far as the angel, I do believe it to be a literal angel. You can read the reference to angels having the seven vials. You could go back to Revelations 15 and 16, where it talks of the seven angels that had the vials, which are the last plagues of God poured upon the earth. Basically punishing man and causing a lot of turmoil on the earth. But we're not going to get into that. What I want to understand is that, first off, as Revelations opens up, Jesus is talking to the churches at that time, and he's dealing with them about the things that they need to do or change in order to live out their lives according to his desire. And so what we have to understand is, as we approach Revelations 21:9, the church age, the age of the church, is with the Lord. Those that came to salvation through means of the establishment of the church, they're gone on to be with the Lord. and you have to do a little bit of studying to put things together. But if you go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, it talks of the rapture. Hopefully most have heard about that. And it's the rapture of the church age. That once the church is raptured up, that age is, or dispensation or time is now no more. Now that doesn't mean that flesh is no longer saved. It just means that through the church itself, no one is saved through the church, through the church age, I should say. So, now, Revelations chapters 2 and 3, they deal with the church. When you go into Revelations chapter 4, after Jesus finishes his conversation to the church, or his message to the church through John, one of the first things it says is, "Come up hither," talking to John, "I will show you things which must be hereafter." So a lot of theology is that after Jesus ends his conversation to the church in chapter 3 and you transition over to chapter 4, essentially in that process, the church is then raptured up, okay? And then what is now taking place after that is that Israel is being restored as the bride. Now, I don't want to misconstrue the church as the bride, but we also need to understand that Israel is also still the bride, okay? We're both the bride, okay? Now, where you tend to get that, or where I tend to get that, if you go back to Jeremiah chapter 3, and I'm just going to read 2 verses of it. I'm going to read verse 1, and then I'm going to read verse 14. So Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 1 says, "They say, if a man put away his wife, and she go from him, and become another man's, shall he return unto her again? Shall not that land be greatly polluted? But you have played the harlot with many lovers, yet return again to me, saith the Lord." So the Lord in this chapter is saying, you're my wife, you've played the harlot. Now I put it to where once a wife plays a harlot, the husband's not supposed to return. But yet I'm telling you to return to me. I'm telling you that I want to restore our relationship. Okay? Jeremiah, if you jump down to them first, verse 14, it says, "Turn, O backsliding children, saith the Lord, for I am married unto you, and I will take you, one of a city and 2 of a family, and I will bring you to Zion." Okay, now he's talking to the Israelites. He's not talking to the church. That's not to say the church is not there. Don't misunderstand that I'm not saying the church is there. Church is already there. It's already with the Lord. But now he's dealing with those that remain of Israel, of his promises that he will restore them as the bride. So when we read this in chapter 21, verse 9, when he talks about, "Come, I'll show you the bride," he's talking about those that will return of the Israelites. Now, as we would continue on in Revelation, if we go beyond chapter 4 and keep coming forward, you'll eventually get to a point where he talks about the 144,000 of Israel being called. And you get that from Revelation 7, verses 2 to 4. It says, "And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel." Okay. Now, don't want to go off down the rabbit trail. I know we've talked about that before with regards to the Jehovah's Witnesses saying only 144,000 will be saved. That's not what this is saying. This is just talking about how many will be called from the basically of the Israelites. And if you keep reading on, it then talks about how many, 12,000 from the 12 different tribes that are mentioned there. Okay, but it's not to say that only 144,000 people will be saved. Okay, don't have time to get into that right now. But then if you keep going forward, then you'll come to understand that there's a great tribulation that comes. And Jesus talked about that before he left, that there would be a great tribulation, and he talked about the woes that were coming and that kind of thing. And that, all that great tribulation and all that should come leads you up to Revelation 19. So there's a lot of chapters in there. Once you get past 7, essentially, chapter 7 up to about 19, then you start hearing about all the things of the Great Tribulation and the whore and Babylon and all those kinds of things. Then you get into Revelation chapter 20, and that's talk about the millennial kingdom or the 1,000-year reign. So Jesus will come and establish Israel, essentially, for 1,000 years, okay? And it talks about how we will rule with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, that's not the new city, the new Jerusalem that comes. That's before that. That's in Revelation 20. And then at the end of Revelation chapter 20, you then see where the devil and all non-believers are cast into the lake of fire. Okay, that's at the very end of chapter 20. Then we came into 21, which, again, Harry did a fantastic job I keep saying that. Deacon Harry did a fantastic job talking about that last week, about the city, the New Jerusalem. And now we're talking about the city coming and a little bit of the descriptions of it. And that's when we come into Revelation 21. So that's all the lead up at a very, very high level, very quick, without going into the details. Before we move on to the lesson, does anybody have anything that they would like to add? Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and get into the lesson, and I will ask kindly for a volunteer to read the first 5 verses, verses 10 to 14 of Revelation 21.
I can do it, Damien.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Revelations 21, starting with verse 10. And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain. I'm sorry, I'm reading that NIV.
That's fine.
And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. Verse 14. The wall of the city had 12 fountains, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we see here the first beginnings of the explanation of this great high city. And even from the start, you know, it's a little bit hard for us to fully understand the magnificence, the brilliance that he's seen. But there are a few things that I'll highlight as far as some takeaways. And the first thing I want to point out is in verse 10, where he talks about he was taken to a great and high mountain. Apologize 1 second. I got to make a slight adjustment. I have my computer on my Bible. Okay. Talks about in verse 10, and he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me that great city. Okay. Now that great and high mountain, it could be understood to be a physical mountain. It could be understood to be a spiritual mountain. This, as I was looking into this great and high mountain, Jesus, when he was tempted of the devil in Matthew 4 and 8, the Bible talks about he was taken to a high mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the world all at once. And you know, the devil said that, you know, obviously I'll give you all these if you just bow down and worship me. And we know what Jesus' response was. But that was one instance of taken to a high mountain, and that could have been a literal mountain. Okay, it could have been in the spirit that he showed all of these, because there could be the argument made: how do you see all the visions? All the kingdoms of the world from one mountain? When even if you go to the top of the highest mountain, you can't, like, say that's in Israel. You can't see Rome from Israel, even if you're at the top of the highest mountain. You just can't. You physically can't do it. But so you could say that it was something of a spiritual nature. In Mark 9:2, Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain, and that's where they witnessed his transfiguration. Okay. Now again, did he take them into a literal mountain? I do believe he took them into a literal mountain, but then when they was transfigured, the mountain really doesn't matter anymore. Now it's all about this elevated spiritual vision. And that's the big thing that I want us to take away from this, that as we read through, one of the big things I want to take away from this, as we read through this, try to keep our vision elevated. Yeah, we want to take things to a physical reality, and it will be a physical reality. I'm not disputing that. But some of the things are too precious for us to understand, too precious for us to really perceive. But if we just spiritually elevate our vision as Peter and James and John were, then we can understand more about the glorious coming of Jesus Christ and this new city that we have promised to us. Now, the next part is that I want it to be understood that we have the elevated vision, but we also have a beacon for all people to see. It talks about how it's a great city, the holy Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, and we'll talk about the size and all that kind of thing. But when you have this great imagery, and it talks about, we're up on this mountain. When you approach a mountain, it's so. You can see it from miles away. I remember driving in through Colorado, and we're near the Rocky Mountains, and it looked like from where we were driving, the mountain was just like a mile or two away, but it was actually like 10, 20 miles away. But it was just so huge for everyone to see, and that's how this city will be. In Psalm 68. Verse 15 to 16, it says, "The hill of God is as the hill of Bashan, and high hill as the hill of Bashan. Why leap ye high hills?" And when it says why leap ye, it means why are you jealous, basically. Why are you jealous, you high hills? This is the hill which God desireth to dwell in. Yea, the Lord will dwell in it forever. So that could be referencing this city that God's going to be placing to dwell in, that it's a beacon for all people. It surpasses any previous civilization. Okay. Now, if we go to verse 11, now we see where it says, "Having the glory of God, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even like a jasper stone, clear as crystal." I was so determined to find something about jasper, so I looked it up, and jasper is used only 7 times in the entire Bible. It's only used 4 times in the New Testament, and pretty much every time except for 1 other time, or 3 other times, 2 other times, I'm sorry. This time it's used as jasper. It's used later again as jasper, that we'll read. And then another time it was used as jasper when describing the image that John saw of Jesus. In Revelations 4, of the Lord. Of Revelations 4, 2 and 3, it says, "And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, the throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne, and he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald." Now that similar description is given, I believe it's in Ezekiel, where it talks about the rainbow being around the head of God. I don't believe that was one of the times that jasper was used in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the times where I saw it was used was in reference to the ephod, and a jasper stone was placed inside of it. So we don't have a lot of information there about what this is about. All that being said, I'm not much into the spirituality of stones and that kind of thing, but I did find something that was a little bit interesting, that jasper is said to have a calming essence to it, and particularly green jasper. Now, as I was looking up jasper, it can come in the colors of green, which is rare. It can come in the color of red, yellow, brown, or brown. And so when we see this, part of the question you have to ask yourself is, well, what color jasper is he referencing? Well, the other thing that I came to understand is back in the 3rd and 4th century BC, they tended to use more green jasper. Why? I don't know. I have no idea. I couldn't figure that out. But anyway, perhaps it's a greenish hue that he's seeing, but it could also be talking about, hey, this calming aspect of jasper, that when you see the presence of this kingdom and of the city, and you see God's presence dwelling there, God's presence has a peace that surpasses all understanding. So perhaps that's what he's referencing, because the other part that he talks about in verse 11 is, he says, even like a jasper, clear as crystal. Jasper is not clear. Jasper is opaque. It doesn't let light through. So how could it be clear as crystal? So perhaps he's talking from a spiritual sense. And the serene calmness that is brought from it. But what we do know is that it's a glorious light. That is the one thing that we can take away from it. And the last thing that I have as far as a takeaway from this is that the city is built for all nations. Okay. Now, how I get that is, as we read through 12 and 14, we see that there's 12 gates, which have the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in 14, you read about the 12 foundations, which were the 12 apostles of the Lamb, of Jesus. Okay. Now, what I tend to understand about this is that the gates and the 12 tribes of Israel is talking about the era of Israel, and the foundation is the era of the church. That no matter how people come, as long as they come reverencing Jesus, whether it's through tribes of Israel or whether it's through the church era, it really doesn't matter, so long as they reverence Jesus as Lord and Savior. So that's why I believe it to be built for all nations. Ezekiel 48, and you can read that. I'm not going to read this, but you can also see a little bit of a reference to about the 12 gates in Ezekiel chapter 48, verses 38 to 34, and the different tribes that are named upon the gates. But you can also read, and I will read this, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. It says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now, hopefully through that, what I just read, it should be understood that this has to be the time that we're reading right now, this Revelation 21, because even up to Revelation 21, there's war upon the earth. There's 1,000 years where Christ reigns, where there's no war. But even after that, there has to be a short time that the devil is loose and goes to create problems for those that believe. So this that Isaiah is talking about has to be during this time that we're reading about this new Jerusalem that's coming. And as I read in there, it talks about all nations shall flow to it. So those are some of the things that I got from this. Does anybody else have anything else from these first 5 verses that they'd like to share, or any questions, or any corrections if I have something misunderstood?
Hey, Damien, when I was reading it, one of the things that caught my eye was that verse 14 says, the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Mm-hmm. He didn't mention that his name was there, which is, I thought he was almost writing about it in the third person. Because if he was one, there's some people that think maybe John the Apostle didn't write it, but that's not real important. But what I thought was important was that the wall of the city had 12 foundations. And this is an actual city. If the city is coming down from heaven, I was wondering, I did wonder for a moment, why did it need foundations?
Sure.
But I think it's symbolic. There's more symbolic that the apostles were the foundations of the church.
Yes.
They were the ones that went out, and if it weren't for them preaching, teaching, and spreading the word, there wouldn't be a church.
Amen.
So for me, I was thinking that this is both literally true and symbolically true. So two things true at the same time. They can be competing thoughts, but they're both true.
Absolutely. That's a very good observation. Absolutely. And I agree. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll go to the next 3 verses. So if someone would be so kind to read verses 15 to 17.
Okay. I'll read it, Brother Damien.
All right, thank you, Lois.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
15 through 15 to 17?
Yes, ma'am.
Verse 15. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city, and the gates of it, and its walls. And the city lies 4 square, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. The length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. And he 17, you said? And he measured the wall of it 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man, that is, of the angel.
All right, thank you.
And where am I supposed to stop?
That's good. You're good right there.
Oh,
that's
okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm calling this one Broad City. And I do have a picture on here for those that are online that you should be able to see. But I'll describe it at the appropriate time for others, just to give a little bit of perspective of the broadness of the city. But before we do that, I did have a question. Why do you think the angel measured the city? Talked about in 15 that he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city. Why do you think the angel measured the city?
Deacon Damien, I think it was to show that, well, first of all, that God is a God of order. First of all, the way that he created the city, he's the designer and maker of the city. So that was one thing. But I think it was also to show that this is a real live city. It's not a mystical city at all. This is something that is tangible. It can be seen, touched, felt. And that's what he wanted John to know so he could write about it. That's just what I think.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%, Rachel. And that's what I put down. I was wanting to see if anybody else came with anything different. And if you do have a different perspective, please share it. But I put down, as an answer to this, affirmation to believers that this is a real physical city. It's not something conjured up, some fictitious, thing that won't be able to be seen, touched, handled, lived in, that kind of thing. It is a real thing. And that is to give believers hope, which if you don't take anything away from this lesson, at least take that. Even if all this imagery is confusing, and it's still partly confusing to me as much as time as I've studied and read through it. There's still parts that are confusing, but it gives me hope because it lets me know and realize that this present time is just for but a moment, even the hard times that we go through. But anyhow, and I want to read a couple of things. I want to read Zechariah Chapter 2, and I'm going to read two different sets of verses. The first one I'm going to read are Zechariah Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It says, I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, Whither goest thou, or where are you going? And he said unto me, To measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof, and what is the length thereof. Okay. Then I'm going to jump down to verses 11 and 12, again in Zechariah chapter 2. It says, And many nations shall be joined to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of thee, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me unto thee. And the Lord shall inherit Judah his portion in the Holy Land, and shall choose Jerusalem again. So again, this to me resonates with the same thing that we're reading here in 21, that in Zechariah 2, it doesn't talk about a golden measuring reed. Perhaps it's mentioned of golden because God is a consuming fire, and he's dwelling in the midst of them. So he perhaps needs things that are sustainable, and gold would be more sustainable than, say, like wood or some sort of cloth, as an example. Okay, that's possibly why he says the golden reed. But regardless, we see a measurement in Zechariah 2, and we see a measurement in Revelation 21 to affirm that it's a real city. And this, to me, resonates also with John chapter 14, verse 2, that I believe we've heard about either in Bible study or in the previous Sunday school lesson, where it says, Jesus said, In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And again, affirmation, confirmation to believers that it is a physical place. Okay. Now, in verse 16, what I put about verse 16 is that it's a symbol of perfect authority. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not one that's huge on numerology. I'm not saying that there's not some potential truth to it. Kind of like how I mentioned about this, these stones and healing properties, and we talked about jasper earlier. But perhaps there are some elements to it, and it talks about in verse 16 that it was 12,000 furlongs. Now we'll talk about how big that is in a minute, but the number 12, according to numerology, is a symbol of perfection and authority. And some potential evidences to that is there were 12 tribes of Israel. There were 12 apostles. There's 12 months in a complete perfect year, right? So, and there are other symbols of 12 throughout the Bible. So perhaps 12,000, this number 12 is a symbol of perfection and authority, God's perfect authority dwelling upon the earth. But getting back to the physical elements of it, 12,000 furlongs would be 1,500 miles. That's the length, the width, and the height of this city are all 1,500 miles in length, 1,500 miles in width, 1,500 miles in height, is what it says. Now, what's interesting, so I have a picture on here for those that can see it. where there's a cube, a golden cube on a globe, and it's supposed to be to scale. And it's covering the map of the United States. And it would be basically taking up the entire central part of the United States, where you would have remaining on the West Coast, you'd have like California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and then on the East Coast you would have you have Florida left, like Georgia, South Carolina. Basically, all you have are the coasts for the most part left, and that's the size of this city. So enormous. And then if you talk about the height really doesn't give justice on the globe. So I looked up some things. I was like, well, if it's 1,500 miles in height, how high is that? Well, you should know that the Earth's atmosphere, depending on where you are, if you're towards the poles, the North or South Pole, it's about 5.6 miles is the length of is how high the Earth's atmosphere. If you're towards the equator, it's more like 11 miles. So between 5.6 to 11 miles is how high the Earth's atmosphere is, and we think that's high. This city is said to extend 1,500 miles high. That would be over 600,000 stories if each story was about 12 feet. That would be 3,600 times taller than the Burj Khalifa, which is the tallest skyscraper in the world at the moment in, I just forgot where, I keep wanting to say Dubai, in Dubai. If you were to stand back 10 miles away from it, so it's in front of you, and you're back 10 miles away from it, and you look, you might be able to see the top, maybe. If you were 5,000 miles away from it, it would still appear 130 times larger than the moon is. If you're 5,000 miles. And just to put that in a little bit of perspective, the distance from the U.S. to Israel is about 6,700 miles. So you'd have to be about 80% of the way from U.S. to Israel. If it was residing in the U.S., you'd have to be about 80% of the way to Israel, look over, and it'd still be 130 times bigger than what the moon appears from where we see it. So just a massive, and that goes with Jesus' word that there are many mansions inside this. And then verse 17, we see that the thickness of the wall is 144 cubits. And again, if you take 144, that's 12 squared. So, you could do the numerology thing again and talk about it. It's perfectly authoritative, and it basically is impregnable. That would be about 216 feet thick, the wall. Now, and again, the key is that it is a physical city, and I believe that's why he says that this is according to the measure of a man, that is of an angel. Okay, and then Zechariah has another verse that corresponds a little bit to this about being impregnable. If you read verse 5 of Zechariah 2, so we read 1 and 2, we read 11 and 12, and now we'll read verse 5. It says, For I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. So we have this perfect. Will it be a physical wall? I tend to believe it will be a physical wall, but the nice thing that Zechariah points out as well is that the Lord said he'll be a wall of fire round about, that it's impregnable. We don't have to worry about anything evil entering into this. It won't be possible. And that also corresponds to the 12 gates of the 12 angels at the 12 gates, that they're there to protect, and nothing evil or harmful will be entering into the city of God. So I'll pause there before we finish off this the last few verses. Anybody else have anything else they'd like to share or add?
Well, symbolic, everything that Rachel said I thought was right. The only other thing that you might get out of it is that in human terms, this is Jerusalem is a finite city. There's only so many people that could fit in it, and it's actually a small place.
Mm-hmm.
But this New Jerusalem is going to be so big that there's going to be room for every person that wants to be there. They'll never run out of space.
Absolutely. Anyone else have anything? So we go to the last.
And Damien, when you were sharing the distance, I want us to imagine, I was reading that it said the distance would be from, if you can encounter New York City to Dallas. That's how big it would be. So I just wanted to give that visual.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
I was thinking, Brother Damien, that these measurements were probably put in because they were trying to relate it to what the people were familiar with. Because, with the building of the temple, God gave some precise measurements and things that he wanted done. So maybe this was a way to, again, reinforce that this was coming from God himself, the
Absolutely.
words that John was writing.
Absolutely. And I agree. And I think that goes in hand with what Rachel was saying, that he's a God of order, that everything that he does is not just, hey, okay, go build a building and then tell me when you're done. Like, no, it's going to be exactly to these specifications. Okay. All right, we'll go to the last part. I'll go ahead and read this. We're going to read verses 18 to 21. It says, and the building of the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was pure gold like unto clear glass. And the foundations of the wall of the city were garnished with all manner of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, the second sapphire, the third a chalcedony, the fourth an emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth a topaz, the 10th chrysoprasus, the 11th a jacinth, the 12th an amethyst, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of one pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. And I titled this section "Majestic City." We get all this explanation about how it looks, again, to the best that John could try to relate to the people, and even for us. And all this goes back to where I opened things up in the beginning. If you described your floor, how would you go about describing your floor such that someone can understand it? And so he's describing this such that he's trying to get us to understand, but in some ways it's just unexplainable beauty. Now, I talked about jasper earlier, that jasper comes in like 4 different colors. It can be red, orange, brown. Red, yellow, brown, or it can be a greenish color. So which color of jasper is he referencing? Not sure. Again, some theologians believe that it will be the more of the greenish color, because back during that time, like in the early part BC, they were using more green for whatever reason. Now, a lot more now, as jasper's reference, it's more the red jasper. Not sure. And then, again, we see this gold is clear glass. Now, gold obviously is not clear, but what I came to understand as I was thinking about it, like how can you talk about gold as clear glass? Well, it had to be that as you look at it, you still see the glory of God, even though you're looking at gold. So I was like, oh, okay, must have to be something. There must be some property of gold that exists that will help us to understand this. And so what I found is that gold is highly reflective of heat and light. And again, we know that God's a consuming fire, and He has this glorious light. that this city is just emanating his light. One thing that I found out interesting about gold is that if you've ever looked at an astronaut's helmet, at least old helmets, I don't know if they still do this or not, but old helmets, it would have a goldish hue on the outside of the astronaut's helmet. The visors of astronauts' space helmets receive a coating of gold that it's so thin that it's partially transparent, and it's like, if I'm reading this correct, it's like 2/millionth of an inch. So take an inch, divide it up into 2 million sections, equal sections, and that's how much, and then place one section of that of gold on top of the helmet, on the visor that they have. The astronauts can still see through it, but even at that thinness, the gold film reduces glare and heat from sunlight. So it still reflects that eminence of sunlight. And perhaps that's what John's trying to explain here, that even though it has this gold hue, I meant to click next so you could actually see it. For those that are on the computer, you can actually see a helmet now. But even though it's gold, it's yet like clear glass, reflecting the beauty of God. And then verse 19 to 20, we see all these different stones that are mentioned: the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, the sardonyx, the chalcedony, the beryl, the topaz, and so forth. And I could go through each one, or you could even look up potentially and see all the different colors. There's greens, there's blues, there's yellowish, there's orangish, there's reddish. But I found this neat kind of picture for those that can see it, and it's a whole bunch of layers of this foundation shown. And anyone that can actually see it, so I guess that might be perhaps Rhonda or Rachel or LaShawn, what does that kind of resemble to you?
Sounds like a rainbow to me.
Okay, thank you. That's what I was looking for. It's not a perfect rainbow, I'll admit, but it's kind of like a rainbow of colors. And the other thing that I thought about on this was, this is the foundation. So a foundation sits upon what? What does a foundation sit on? It's not a trick question.
Rock.
Sits on rock. Jesus talked about building up on a rock. Some people might put foundation on sand. I don't know why they would do that, but they may do that. Maybe dirt. But it sits upon the earth ultimately, right? It sits upon the earth. Well, where do we get the combination of a rainbow and earth? Well, if you go to Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, it says, "I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth." So as I was reading this, I was like, well, perhaps I don't know what all these why the city would even need a foundation. Kind of like what Harry was saying earlier. I don't even understand fully why it would need a foundation. It's so big, so massive, so huge. It would be immovable from anything anyway, and plus God's there to keep it. So why does it really need a foundation? Perhaps this is symbolic of that God is showing that He's continuing His covenant upon the earth, that once He establishes His kingdom, that in other sections it talks about how a lion will be laying with a calf, a cow, something that it would normally be its prey. It would be attacking. It talked about how a kid could be playing upon the hole of an adder, of a serpent that would probably try to protect itself and bite. But in this time, there's nothing that will be destroying in this holy kingdom. So perhaps it's a covenant. It's showing that continued covenant that God has with the earth, that now there will be total peace upon earth, even as He did in Genesis 9:13. And the last bit that I have is that verse 21, it talks about the 12 gates of Plural. And this to me was God's access plan reminder, that why would the gates be made of pearl? I'm not fully sure, but the other relationship that I had to a pearl in the Bible was the pearl of great price. Matthew 13 verses 45 to 46. It says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchant man seeking goodly pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it." Now that pearl is obviously Jesus Christ. And as I'm bringing all of this lesson that I believe God's given me to a close, we have a lot of description of things that we don't fully understand. We see through a glass darkly, as it said in 1 Corinthians. We don't fully understand why all these things are. And we won't fully know why all these things are until we're in the presence of God. However, what is to be reminded of this is that regardless of what it is, there is an access plan, and that access plan is Jesus Christ. Perhaps that's why he references gates made of pearl, that Jesus Christ is that pearl of great price that we're to aspire to, and that when we find it, we find the gates to heaven to enter in. And I will pause after I finish this last bit. And the last bit that I have for everyone, the last section I put was bring it back to Jesus. No matter what situation you're going through, no matter what you're talking to someone about, no matter what you're evangelizing about, Pastor has an evangelism class coming up, and I can guarantee you, he's going to teach a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's all going to be brought back to Jesus. And that's Jesus. If Jesus is lifted up, he will save. He will draw men to him.
Amen.
So don't let all this confusing talk of Revelation, I mean, again, it's confusing to me and I'm teaching it. Don't let all the confusing thought or even people that want to argue over Revelations, believers arguing over Revelation, oh, no, it means this, oh, it means that. Don't worry about all that. We'll know in due time. Bring the conversation back to Jesus. John 14, 2 and 3, leaving you with this. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So all we need to know, and the only thing that we need to really provide to people, is that there's a hope. We get a description in Revelation of what that coming hope is.
Amen.
That we don't fully understand, but the point is that there's a hope, and that hope is Jesus Christ.
Amen.
I'll leave it. That's all I have for the lesson. Are there any questions, or is there anything else that anybody else got from this? And believe me, you won't hurt my feelings if you provide me corrections as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Damien. I know, I think it's Philippians 3:20 talks about our citizenship in heaven, and as you were teaching, that's what I was thinking about. And I love that you ended the lesson with bring it back to Jesus, and that, we have a blessed hope. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else?